right. Today, if there are no questions, what I plan on doing is showing just real briefly where we ended last time, which we were looking at obsessive compulsive disorders. Today, what I'd like to do is introduce kind of on the scale of severity the topic of psychological disorders, of almost a deeper or strongly more impacting kind of disorders, schizophrenia, and then the, depression and things like manic depression. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at these disorders, and then hopefully you might have questions and ideas. Are there any questions that you have, first of all, about as we leave this topic and as we head to the topic of schizophrenic disorders? Anything from your notes? All right. We're going to dive right in then, and on the topic of schizophrenic disorders. There are a number of different ways to approach this, but what I thought I would do is introduce a couple of people by video that suffer from some of the various symptoms and various categories of schizophrenic disorders. How many of you are familiar with any movies that have been made about somebody with schizophrenia? Give me an example of a movie that uses a schizophrenic maybe as the context or schizophrenia as a disease. Yeah, A Beautiful Mind. How many remember that movie, A Beautiful Mind? Okay, that's a good one. Any others that you're familiar with? There are some that are out there. They're maybe not as well known. A Beautiful Mind is based upon a true story. And that true story was about a mathematician, a guy named John Nash, played by Russell Crowe in the movie A Beautiful Mind. And John Nash was, and still is, he's alive today. He works probably retired, who knows, but at Princeton in their math department, a senior researcher there. And back in the 50s, John Nash started experiencing some very interesting symptoms. And if you remember the movie, the odd part was it seemed real. The movie brought you in to his paranoia, and then only later did you realize this might have been something going on up in his head. And that makes schizophrenia, by the way, one of the most challenging disorders that we know, because the people who suffer from this disorder live their life as if they believed all of this. So if you ever talk to somebody with paranoid schizophrenia or different forms of this, you'll find that it takes over their life as this is what he believed. He believed he was being followed. He believed that people were looking to send messages to him. He believed he was picked to receive and decode these messages, and he was brilliant in math. I mean, he's got theories like in game theory that have won the Nobel Prize. So there's a lot of brilliance in what he has accomplished in life, and yet the disorder that he suffers from is a disorder that alters his thinking and disturbs it in a way that presents unique challenges to his family and the people around him when they see he's not dealing with reality or the same reality we're dealing with. So A Beautiful Mind was the story, and is the story of John Nash, who a mathematician who deals with schizophrenia, and it's about this process of adjusting and living a life to schizophrenia that involves a lot of disorganized thinking and disturbed emotions. And that's a definition of schizophrenia. It's this group of disorders. And that means there's a variety of different ways it comes out and shows up. And there's a variety of ways that we see somebody with schizophrenia present themselves. Sometimes they might approach the world and you could be talking with someone and not really know they're schizophrenic. It might take a little bit of time. So oftentimes you'll see somebody that maybe you encounter. Recently I was having a meal with somebody, and I was with my daughter, and we bought this man something to eat. He looked hungry. And so as we talked to him, you would think, well, he's fairly normal. He could converse with us. So we were standing in line. I asked him how he's doing and what he wanted to eat. And he said that. And I said, tell me about life. How are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm doing great. He started talking about how, some of the things going on. And then he said, as soon as I get back and my sister is no longer on the throne, then I will assume being the king, which was rightfully my place. And I said, oh, so where are you a king at? And he said, in Scotland, I think that's where he said. And he proceeded to describe what it was like to be, the king there and to live here, and how he's looking forward to doing that. And so we got our hamburger, hot dog, and we sat down and ate and visited. He knew something. He was conversational, lucid. We could talk about things. He went like this. At some point, he finally, this is maybe the second or third time I had interacted with him and had a meal with him. And this one time he said, so what do you do? And I said, I work at a school called, university called Biola. I'm a teacher there. And he goes, oh, Biola. B-I-O-L-A. That's the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. And I said, yep. And he kept repeating it. The Bible Institute of Los Angeles. I said, The Bible Institute of Los Angeles. That's where I work. That's where you work. The Bible Institute of Los Angeles. It would have been a normal conversation. A little bit awkward, but pretty normal. You see, schizophrenia is this symptom of people who have beliefs about things that are a little bit odd. Being the king of Scotland is a little bit weird. But so is the paranoia that accompanies them. Paranoia like this, people are following me, they're trying to get me, and it causes people with paranoid symptoms to do some interesting, weird things. I was sitting right over here in my office. It had to have been at least 10 years ago, because I was in a building over here, right in that temporary buildings right near the cafeteria, and I was sitting there in my office, and I heard this. I heard yelling and screaming outside, or just kind of yelling, and then I heard like that on the side of this, trailer, whatever temporary building, and it was loud. And so I look outside, and there is a man who is very agitated. And he's angry, so I thought, somebody's, in an argument or a fight. So I kind of look out the window, and as he comes around the corner, he's by himself, and he's just arguing with nobody. It's just himself. And he's very agitated and very angry and carrying on. So it was I think it was in the summer, and there were some people that were attending a conference here, and I saw them walking up, seeing him, and you could see in their face, they're like, ew. And they kind of stopped, and they walked around, and they waited, and they kind of went around him quite a distance. And he was kind of walking, and I watched out for him, and I watched him walk on campus. I didn't recognize him. He was a little bit older than a traditional student. And I saw him heading over here towards the library. And I guess I didn't really think much of it, and so I called actually someone at the switchboard, and I told Kim, hey, just so you know, there's a guy on campus who's very angry. He's yelling at himself, not anybody in particular, and he's just kind of scaring people, but I think he went to the library. I just want to let you all know, just in case, It's usually quiet in the summer, there's not much going on, but so they said, okay, thanks. About 10 minutes later, I get a phone call from Campus Safety. They say, hey, we got a guy in the library, and you're one of the few people around. Would you come over here and talk to him and see what you think about this guy? And we're a little bit concerned because he seems a little bit angry, and he's talking about people and things like that. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll come over there. So I went over and I talked to him, and I went up and I just visited with him. And he's lucid, he can talk. He was there doing research, and he was thinking of taking a class at Biola, and he wasn't an official student yet, But I also noticed he was pretty agitated, but in my opinion, you have to watch people and kind of make a decision, you know, and they asked me, what would you do? What do you think? And the camp safety guys, what do you think? Is he dangerous? And I said, you know what, I don't think he's dangerous. I think he's a little bit angry or something, but I think he'll be fine. But they said, should we let him on campus or kick him out? You know, they were asking my advice. I said, well, I don't think he's going to be a harm to anybody, but you know, he's not a student, so you can do whatever you want as far as, you know, take him off campus, but he's not going to hurt anybody. And so, they said, okay, great, thanks. So they talked to him, and so I left, and I went back to my office. And I walked right over here to this park, right over there under the bell towers, and it dawned on me, I remembered seeing this guy earlier, about an hour or two earlier, get out of a car, and I remember that guy now. He got out of a car right next to me. And I went, oh, I remember the car he got out of. So I'll just walk over there and look at his car, just to see. So I walked over to his car, and I went, oh, that is his car. It was old and busted, messed up. And inside the car was a pistol on the passenger seat of the car. And in the back seat were 6 5-gallon gas tanks, 6 of them filled with liquid. And so I went back over to the campus safety guys. And I called one of them over. I said, hey, you know, I've been thinking about something. You know what I said, that guy, I'm having a second thought. And so I told him, he goes, what happened? I told him, and he goes, you should have seen his look. And so here was one campus safety guy walking that guy over there. And here was the guy I was telling, he goes, and he turned, man, and he ran, and he laid that guy out, man, not right in front of the Jesus mural. He knocked him over and put him in handcuffs. And he said, is that the guy? Yeah, that's the guy. He goes, is that your car? And the guy's like, what happened? What did you do? And, you know, and so they're pulling him up and walking him over there. And so they're now saying, you know, why, you know, what the car, what's it look like? And he goes over there, and they're like, oh. And you could see the little bubble above his head. I will never call this man again to tell me if this guy is dangerous or not, because he obviously missed that one. But something was wrong. It was his car. They called the sheriff, but they also called his dad. And as I was sitting there talking with him, see, I worked with schizophrenia. I worked in a maximum security ward with the criminally insane. Did an internship there. Maximum security, criminally insane. This guy wasn't like that. And there wasn't, and so there was something wrong. And so I would sit there talking to him, and he wasn't dangerous. He seemed distracted and worried and nervous, and especially now. I mean, he got tackled right in, front of that thing. And he's lying there with, handcuffs on, and he's freaked out, and the sheriffs are coming, and we called his dad, and his dad was there. But something wasn't right. And the thing that wasn't right was that he didn't seem, you know what it was? At the end of the day, just to get to the end of the story, the end of the story is they asked about it. It was a pistol, but it was a BB pellet gun. And the gas cans in the back, you know what they were? They were full of his urine. Oh my God. Because he was afraid people were following him and walking him and tracking him, and they were checking his urine content wherever so he's afraid to pee somewhere because people were analyzing his thoughts. So he'd pee in the back of his car in the gas cans. Now, do you think he's dangerous? Hey, well, something, yeah, no. Hey, it was to protect that. Now, see, his thinking was this: people are following me, and they're watching me, and they're listening for me, and they're out to get me, and that would make you a little bit nervous. So that was to protect him from people who would try and steal his urine, and therefore steal him and his thoughts. By the way, he drove home that day. There was nothing he did wrong. It was nothing he had in that car was illegal. And the sheriff said, yeah, released him into his custody of his father, who said sometimes he doesn't take his medication and he gets a little bit freaked out. Sometimes we make decisions like that about people. Are they dangerous? Are they harmful? And they feel the world is that way. So this group of disorders really has some odd pieces to it. I want to show you a little film on what it's like, and you'll see some of the, listen to some of the things, watch, there's a thing called word salad you'll see in just a minute. When I'm talking with this guy at the restaurant that I see all the time, and we'll have a meal together. He'll start talking about things like being King of Scotland and other things, and he'll just go off on the weirdest tangents. And you think you're following, and all of a sudden it just goes off in weird places, and you're like, I'm not following that. And so another person, same kind of thing. I was with my daughter, and we were at Burger King, and we just got him some food, and we sat down and talked with him, and he was going on and on about how his aunt was the Black Dahlia. That was his aunt, and then he was really worried about that. And he had 4 degrees. He would say, I've got my master's from, and he named all these big schools, from UC Berkeley, from Stanford, from Harvard, and I'm finishing my one up at Yale. And he looked like he was 20, and he was clearly not really well dressed, and he was a little bit homeless, as a matter of fact. And so you knew that wasn't true, and yet he would have this story concocted, but he would go off into weird places. So watch in here for things like that, what we call word salads and disturbed thinking and paranoia, and you'll see it kind of pop in there.
Suppose you are parents who have spent years raising a bright, attractive, and promising child. Then, just when your child's adult life is beginning, somewhere between the ages of 17 and 25, their personality changes.
Oh yeah, I'm really scared about this thing. I'm a frightened little girl. I'm scared.
In a matter of months, the child you knew is lost forever into a world of delusions and hallucinations.
I think those bats and the witch and Cliff were really my father, but the Tin Man wouldn't let me date my father. Too big, He never really stopped me, but...
You seek out the best doctors you can find and are told that your once healthy child now has an incurable brain disease. You learn that he may never recover from the illness. Doctors can't even tell you what causes it.
Some people like killing hamburgers, and some people like killing sodas. Some people like killing other people. Some people like killing eyes.
It's a cruel life sentence of missed opportunities and lost hopes and dreams. It is a mysterious and frightening disease. It is schizophrenia. It is madness. Most schizophrenics don't live in hospitals or on the streets. They live with their families. Bob is 35 years old and has been sick for 17 years. He's lived at home with his parents in West Virginia for most of that time.
This was from the Forensic League. Seal of approval.
Bob was once the captain of his high school's debating team. He now experiences extreme thought disorder and talks in a disconnected jumble of words.
I know how to angle myself for the rest of the men, do you see? That's why I did that to Sue. That's why I did that to Aunt Ethel, And I wanted Fritz and all of them to know, the praying mantis and the spider and the grasshopper, to know that I think it's very important that we act badly, but I think it's very important that we act in reality of what makes the world go round. You're liable to go sliding off the curb into your death.
Bob was a very serious person from the first day he was born. We thought surely he was happy. He had just about everything. We spent a lot of time with him, and we loved him very much. This was our first child, and we had a lot of hopes and expectations of Bob, because he was a very smart fella, and his coordination was great in sports. He liked government affairs, he liked politics and the like. As I say, he excelled in math. He had 4 years of math in high school. He accepted the responsibilities of his homework on his own and did a bang-up job. He was an all-American boy.
Bob's was a typical case. Schizophrenia struck him at age 18, during his first year of college.
And it came on suddenly. And then he got to where he was calling home 2 or 3 times a day, and then 4 and 5 times a day, and then in the middle of the night he'd call and talk an hour, always to be reassured. And we could not understand this. We just didn't know what was happening. And finally, on Thursday, before his final exam started on the following Monday, he called and he said, Mom, my mind is going. I'm losing my mind.
As Bob walks, he constantly hears imaginary voices, perhaps the most dramatic symptom of schizophrenia. He hears these voices as clearly as he hears the voices of real people talking to him.
Are you going to still stay around here? Want some hot chocolate?
Bob can't control or stop these voices, which always torment and criticize him.
So how you feeling, Bob?
I just had to claim life.
What's that?
Had to claim life.
Claim life.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
You said that I have never been a man in my life, therefore I have to claim
no,
life.
I didn't
yeah.
say that.
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
You'll be a man.
You'll be a man someday.
Bob is one of the 40% of schizophrenics that don't respond to any drug treatment.
Bob falls into this interesting category of schizophrenics. We kind of call it the law of thirds, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute, where a third tend to get better as time goes on and live normal, quote, lives, and a third kind of go in and out, and then a third, like Bob, or what we call these chronics, chronic schizophrenics. What are some symptoms you noticed in there that you might have saw some of these? Give me some symptoms that you saw. Anything in the video? We call, okay, yeah, delusions. You sometimes hear voices. A disconnected flow of thought. We saw, so bizarre delusions. Let's try that one. Delusions sometimes can take the place, can be like delusions of grandeur, in addition to paranoid delusions. So paranoid would be people are out to get me, they want to follow me, track me, listen to my conversations. There was a man who, whenever a dog would bark, a schizophrenic, he'd go like this. Oh, did you hear that dog? That dog is following me. Dogs follow me. In fact, he thought dogs were anthropologists sent here from other planets to spy on him. So anytime a dog would bark, it would give him evidence that there are, he was so important that anthropologists from other planets, in the form of dogs, would come here to follow his thoughts. That's a delusion of grandeur. A belief that you're bigger than you are. Hey, my friend from, Wiener Schnitzel's where we would eat a lot in meals, and he thought he was the king of Scotland. And that delusion was of grand nature. Same with the person here on campus one time, many years ago, that believed he was being followed, and that's a paranoid delusion. That you saw the hallucinations. He heard voices telling him or accusing him of things. Sometimes they could be visual things, even tactile, things you might feel. I had you listen to some of those weird, what we call word salads. People would throw them in and mix in kind of references to things that really just didn't make any sense. These, what we call loose word associations. I'll show you another person, a word salad, and how he shows kind of all of these. I'll show a quick video. It's an older video, and sorry about the quality on some of these, but they illustrate some of these symptoms, and some of them are fascinating to watch and to work with, and you'll see kind of some schizophrenics dealing with this almost like a turning into themselves, turning into an inner world, and then these emotional issues, they don't oftentimes have the same emotional responses to things that we would think normally would occur. All right. So let me show you. I'll put that back up in just a second. And this is Jerry. Jerry, I want to show you what it looks like in many, like in the place I worked on, a maximum security ward, is a little bit different, but not all that different. Sometimes for individuals that are a harm to themselves or to others, may be placed in more strict settings, and sometimes they're in wards that are not strict at all. In fact, you'll see one on here where you can walk around and meander. No one's a danger to anyone. But Jerry lives on a ward like this, and you'll see some of his symptoms, and watch for some of this word salad stuff as well.
Gerald S. is grossly delusional and thought disordered. He is currently on the following medications: haloperidol, 32 milligrams daily; benztropine B, 4 milligrams daily.
Please sit down. How are you doing?
Not doing so hot. I think and feel as though people have called me here to electrocute me, judge me, put me in jail, or kill me, electrocute me because of some of the sins I've been in.
Is this a new feeling for you?
The main thing is don't get excited, but the thing is it's not a new feeling, no. I'm scared of people.
Must be very frightening for you, though. Feel like you're about to get killed.
I'm so scared I can tell you that picture's got a headache.
Can you tell me more about that? The picture has a headache? Could you?
You want to know?
Yes, I do.
Okay, when a sperm and an egg go together to make a baby, only one sperm goes up in the egg. And when they touch, there's 2 contact points that touch before any other 2. And then it's carried up into the egg. And when they fuse, it's like nuclear fusion, except it's human fusion. There's a mass loss of the proton. One heat abstraction goes up in the electron, spins around, comes back down into the proton to form the mind, and the mind can be reduced to 1 atom.
Jerry, in one patient at one time, shows almost every one of the major features of schizophrenia. His thinking is disorganized. The thoughts are loosely connected. He has formed delusional ideas. Some of those delusions are grandiose. Some of them are paranoid. He has disturbances in his mood. His mood is, in some cases, almost absent, and in other cases is totally inappropriate. And his behavior is disordered. It's unusual. He has mannerisms that are inexplicable. He has purposeless, aimless behavior around the ward. He's a textbook case. He combines all those things in one person.
At this point, what would you like us to do for you?
I'd like you to get me off of cigarettes, get me dried out, cleaned up, so I can go home and get a job in a bakery and go to medical school.
I guess the way I think of schizophrenia is that schizophrenia is an illness. It's a total picture. It's not like a peculiarity of behavior. It's not as if somebody has a sort of idiosyncrasy or has some peculiar way of doing things or thinking things. Schizophrenia is an involvement of a person in illness. There is abnormalities of behavior. There are abnormalities of thinking. There are abnormalities of feeling. There are abnormalities of the way people move across a room. There are peculiarities in what people perceive. There seems to be a very global impairment of what we think of as the highest psychological functions, the most intricate, sophisticated, complex psychological functions that people have.
What happens is you've got a healthy, or can have a relatively healthy young adult, or a young person turning into adulthood, who begins to go into a psychosis, withdraws from the people who he or she loves, and is distant from those people. At the same time, that individual, that child, is clearly in enormous emotional pain, psychological pain, can't interact with people, and has a disease which can last for years.
So this would be a typical ward, what it would look like. for some that are housed there. They can come and go. They're a little bit, some are paranoid, so you'll see if you walk down with the camera, they're going to shut the door on you and get up and leave. They don't want to be around you much, but there's no restrictions on their movement usually.
In order to understand the kinds of patients that we have on this ward, you've got to remember that schizophrenia breaks down into the rule of quarters. A quarter of people who get the disease will get well and not get sick again. Another quarter will get relatively well on medication and be able to live independently. A third quarter will be able to live in a group facility on medication, and the other quarter will do very poorly. 10% of the people, in fact, will suicide within 10 years, and 15% won't respond to medication at all.
That last quarter he's talking about are on this ward. A lot of those who are there permanently.
People with chronic schizophrenia, when they've had the disease for more than a few years, almost certainly have some brain damage from the disease.
This would be an example for, I'll show you this type of schizophrenia. This is one called Catatonic. So on the ward I worked at, for example, he might not move all day from that spot. The schizophrenia seems to take over his body as well as his mind, and so he will so one would walk, he would pace about a distance of, I don't know, 15 feet and not vary in the way he would move and walk. He'd hold his Quran and he would just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and he could stay there all day. That's catatonic. There's also those that, more like her, they're not on a ward. They're going to, however, get into problems at different times because of their schizophrenia. So watch her for a second and you'll see.
I get to the point where I don't want to live anymore because the mental process of the mind takes over. When I think I'm doing good for a while, something mental takes over and it scares me. Years ago, I didn't do that. Years ago, I didn't have to worry about that one thing. I was one less paranoid. I mean, one less crazy. I was one less crazy. I mean, years ago, I didn't have this new mental problem. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty scary. That's why I called the police. Nobody else was doing it. Boy, those people at 7-Eleven, they're always on the phone talking about me. Always. Especially in the summertime, nice weather. They're always talking about me, calling hospitals, Barnes, St. John's. There's a lot of doctors at, not 7-Eleven, Quick Trip. You know what Quick Trip is? There's always a lot of doctors and nurses going there making porn, like kill her or do something to her.
Do you notice changes in your attention, with your illness?
Huh?
Do you notice changes in attention with your illness?
I'm retarded.
But do you notice having problems focusing attention or keeping your attention on things?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I don't know. What was that again?
When's the last time you felt good?
I don't remember. It's killing me. It's keeping me from having a boyfriend, keeping me from driving. It's killing me. Like in China or somewhere. I just believe if somebody's been suffering years ago, they should take an OD and die, because psychologically they may not want to take the OD, but to get out of their misery, they might. They fight it every night. And every day he's always fighting with me. Michael's always fighting with me. Drop dead, geek, retarded bitch. Oh, that stuff doesn't mean shit to me anymore. I'm so used to it. I do have a brain problem. But I don't have a brain tumor.
So you can see here some of the symptoms that show up in this, and this is a tough illness, y'all. And the odds, what percentage of people develop schizophrenia over their lifetime? 1 in 100. So this is not a disorder that is rare. In fact, I've traveled around different parts of the world. I was in Russia one time, standing there on a street corner not far from Red Square, and it's clear I would walk past and interact and talk with schizophrenics. Mostly because they would look and do and say similar kinds of things that they would hear. It's across the board, male and female. And it oftentimes doesn't strike individuals until they're 16, 17, 18 years of age. In fact, that's the most common time. And so let me only open up real quick for questions that you might have. Yeah? Well, that's a great question, because the question is, how can you tell the difference between, let's say, some of these delusions or paranoia that are just simply the result of having, a disorder like schizophrenia, and maybe not a drug-induced type of it's really hard to tell the difference. In fact, individuals that sometimes use certain medications or drugs illegally, for example, methamphetamines, can develop very strong paranoia thinking. Same with cocaine use. But one, because it's all hitting at the same dopamine systems, right? And it's messing it up. In fact, if we were to take just any spinal tap from any of the people you just saw in these videos, you would look and you would see an increased amount of dopamine in their system, just like what would happen with a lot of drugs that are abused. And so the answer is, sometimes you don't know. In fact, sometimes you find symptoms like this in older people when they're taking certain medications to control. For one thing, their paranoia increases a lot, and you're realizing you're messing with some of these chemicals in the brain that have a huge impact and result in things like that. So I told you before, if you remember back to earlier lectures, we talked about what we would give individuals with schizophrenia like this is something that would block dopamine, and it would shorten the life of it would just decrease the amount of dopamine in the system. But if we did too much of that on the ward, these individuals would start to show shakes, like Parkinson's disease, because people with Parkinson's don't have enough dopamine. And so it was always this kind of mix, and so you see there's these connections, and they go back to some very fine tuning that we have in our brain for most people. So question, yeah, go ahead.
Is there a difference in how common it is between men and women?
With schizophrenia, there's not a lot of differences. It's the 1 in 100 seems to strike males and females equally. You might run into them differently, in public, simply because some get different treatment and different help, rates, let's say. But no, and with schizophrenia, it's pretty straightforward. With things like depression and manic depression, there's some gender differences, but not as much with schizophrenia. But yeah.
So what's the spiritual relationship between somebody that's hearing voices telling them all these things and spiritual?
Yeah. What's the connection between this? Let's say for some. We would, let's say, your question was, there are some who in the spiritual realm might hear voices or see things, or hear, is that what you're saying or asking? Yeah. What's the connection between a psychological disorder and, let's say, what we would say is maybe something spiritual going on in their lives? Would that be a fair question, or is that how to? Yeah. I'll tell you what, I think it is an interesting question. In this culture, we are very scientific, clinical, psychological. When someone's like this, we will see a lot of clinical, psychological diagnoses, but that's not the case in all cultures. When people talk or hear voices, it's not because they're psychologically disturbed, right? It's because maybe there's a different connection with the spiritual world. I was talking to a friend today from Nigeria. And we were talking about this very topic because he works there, and he goes, I came to this country a few years ago to study, and he goes, and I cannot believe how much there are things like psychological diagnoses. In my country, he goes, they would just be considered, they would have a demon. Clear, and that was the default was they were dealing with in the spiritual realm if they acted like that. In this culture, I think there's a different default. So I'll tell you what, I'll give you a way to distinguish these real quickly that I've used and that some people have used to help determine, is this really psychological? Is it drug induced? Could it be, like some other cultures say, there's some other spiritual things going on? And there's a way of kind of looking at those differences real quick. So let me answer that in just a minute. Two things real quick. The onset is very important. Some individuals that have sudden onset, in other words, they're 19, 20, they're for the most part have been fine, and all of a sudden now they're starting to show these symptoms, reactive, or maybe they're 70 years old and they're taking certain kinds of medications and all of a sudden they're starting to show these. That sudden onset, we call it reactive schizophrenia, has a fairly good prognosis. The likelihood of them getting better is good, probably because it might be brought on by other things, or, and again, they're still not sure, but a sudden onset tends to have a better prognosis than someone with a gradual onset. That is, they're 16 and they have beginning symptoms of, let's say, a little bit of paranoid thinking or delusions of grandeur, or they might have some, they might hear voices, and that goes on slowly. Then at 17 it gets worse, then at 18 it gets even worse, and then like the guy we saw who left college, it just gets worse and worse and worse. Kind of that gradual onset over a course of a year or two, their prognosis seems to not be as positive out there. So those are two different ways and other ways. Different type, oh yeah, question, go ahead.
I know that different like sicknesses cause for things like anxiety, depression, and things like that. For example, like thyroid problems. When I was 16 years old, I was diagnosed with hyperthyroid, and like instantly I was like more anxious. And then I noticed if I drink coffee, I get anxious. Or at the time, I'm like a bubbly person. I was depressed and all this stuff. So how do you know what the difference is between
Well, yeah, it's a great question. She says sometimes there are physical things like a thyroid problem that can manifest themselves like anxiety and other things. And the answer is, how do you know? It's really difficult to know. You do the process of elimination is what many doctors will do. If some of you are experiencing anxiety, like you'll go in and they'll do a thyroid test right away. And I had a friend who went in last week, and the first thing the doctor said, "How much caffeine are you drinking?" And he goes, "I drink caffeine all the day long. Cup of coffee in the morning and iced tea all day." He says, "Well, stop it, and let's see what happens." And then he also gave him a blood test. It's because you could eliminate some things instead of diagnosing the person with anxiety right away. There might be other things. And so broad, complex causes and that could result in a variety of these symptoms looking similar. And that's the hard part. So just so you know, I did mention the catatonic, showed you a little picture of a person like that. That's how you spell it, catatonic. It involves the full body, the whole body. Or paranoids you've been seeing. So they seem to, most paranoids tend to like cluster around paranoia, or the delusional grandeur ones, or sometimes even the ones that someone might have visual, or even kind of abnormalities, or hearing of voices like that, and these, or emotional abnormalities, and they kind of cluster around that. Question?
For schizophrenia, is it more of an environmental factor or genetic factor?
Well, causes, if you want to ask the question, is it genetic, environmental? I mean, golly, genetics are going to play a role with schizophrenia. I mean, you can look at twin studies and find that if you have an identical twin and your identical twin, remember genetics, you share 100% of the same genetic background as your identical twin, and if that twin becomes schizophrenic, if it's purely genetic, the odds of you becoming schizophrenic are what? It's 100%. I mean, if schizophrenia is a genetic disorder purely passed on, by our genetic makeup, then having an identical twin is going to ensure you're going to also develop schizophrenia. But, ready? Their odds are 50-50. So if you have an identical twin, you have a 50-50 chance of you yourself. So is it genetic? Yes, partially. Because your odds of getting schizophrenia are only 1 in 100, but if you're an identical twin and your twin has it, your odds are 1 in 2. So there is genetics in there. if you have one parent who's schizophrenic, your odds go from like 1 in 100 to now they increase. I think it's 1 in, well, it's up here. If you have one parent, it's about 13%, 14%, whatever. So identical twins have about and if both of your parents are schizophrenic, you also have only a 50-50 chance. Okay, so the point is, with some of these, fraternal twins, your odds go down the less you are genetically related to someone with schizophrenia. So if you have one parent, if you have a sibling, your odds instead of 1 in 100, they're 1 in 10. A nephew or niece, if you're married to somebody with schizophrenia, your odds double from 1 to 2. I don't know why, but they just go up. We know, I mentioned dopamine. Dopamine is indeed in high amounts. It doesn't mean it's what's causing schizophrenia. Just because someone has too much dopamine doesn't always necessarily mean that's what's causing it. In fact, the answer to saying what's the cause of schizophrenia is too much dopamine is really not very helpful, because all it's saying is, while we find schizophrenics with an increase in that, it doesn't mean one's causing the other. But that is a way of knowing or measuring or checking. And then, of course, there are some psychological things, stress and maybe family dynamics, but most of those I put question marks after, because a lot of people have stresses and weird family dynamics and they don't develop schizophrenia. So we know that's not it. It plays a role. Plays a role.
Well, yeah, and then my endocrinologist said that that hyperthyroid was brought on by stress.
Yeah, and then stress comes into play in thyroid conditions as well. So now you add another variable on top of those variables. So,
right, yeah.
And genetic, variabilities that come in as well. All right, a question so far? I'm going to kind of. Yep. Yeah, the question is, if someone has used drugs in their past, is there a stronger likelihood that with some of their brain changes that they're more susceptible to this later on? Is that the question? And the answer is, unfortunately, there are situations in which that's the case. Past drug use, it does have changes in the brain, and the brain uses chemicals differently now and responds differently to chemicals. There's good news and bad news. Yes, you're slightly more susceptible. But the good news is, the brain is very, what? Yeah, it's malleable. It heals itself very well, just like the body seems to. So sometimes, if it's not overdone and permanent brain changes, the brain has a way of healing, and you become almost normal functioning again. So there is a little bit there, and it depends on what kind of drugs and how often. And methamphetamines, for example, it could harm the brain much stronger. Marijuana doesn't sound like it does much, but it lodges itself in the brain and does have a problem later on that we're discovering in certain areas like memory. But so it just depends on what kind of drugs and how often and the extent. All right. By the way, the question was this: what role does the spiritual play? Someone asked that question. In this culture, we tend to ignore the spiritual as a cause. So I would go in, in this ward. There were clearly people on this ward that I thought, as I talked with them and interacted with them, and the schizophrenics that now you'll see and interact with sometimes, if you see someone on the streets, a third of the time, they could very well be dealing with a psychological disorder. Some think the homeless population might be as high as 25, 30% could be dealing with psychological disorders like schizophrenia. And sometimes you'll talk to them, and I think it's a good question, right? My friend from Nigeria asked this question, but he lands on a completely different side. He wouldn't say, what role does the spiritual play? He says, what role does the psychological play? Because he thinks it's all spiritual. That's what he sees in that over there. And various cultures have various ways. So this is a very valid question. Is spirituality an impact on this? I would talk with these individuals, and one of the things I noticed, so here's a guy, I'm sitting there talking to him, ready? We're visiting and talking, and I walk in, well before that, I walk onto, you go through all these, locked doors, and it's barred, and again, it's maximum security. And I go in, and it's open, kind of like what you saw once you get in, and there was a new guy there in handcuffs and leg cuffs, I guess. And so he's just sitting there. I go, oh, who's the new guy? And they say so-and-so. And I think that's interesting. And they say, oh yeah, he's Moses, is what they called him. And because he believed he was Moses. So this was, I thought, well, let's look over, I'll go talk to Moses and see what's going on with him and go visit with Moses. So I went and talked to Moses, and he was a very interesting man. He was clearly disturbed. But he scared me. The others didn't. I was properly careful because, again, where I was and knowing these were more of the kind of the dangerous types. But Moses seemed odd, seemed different. If there was any one person that I thought had a weirdness to them, it was him. So I talked to Moses, and I would sit there and ask questions and over a couple of days period. And then I went home and I told my dad one day, just kind of in a casual conversation, that I was talking with a guy named Moses. He goes, "You were talking with Moses?" And well, my dad works at the state penitentiary, or used to work at the state penitentiary in Colorado, also in the maximum security ward there. He was a retired police officer. And I said, "Yeah, Moses." And he goes, "Does he have a tattoo right here with brown hair?" And I said, "Uh-huh." And he goes, "You were talking with him?" And I'm like, "Oh, crud, Dad, what does that mean? Just tell me." He goes, "Was he shackled?" And I said, "Yes, he was." He goes, "Well, that's good." And then I go, how do you? He goes, he was in the state penitentiary. He stabbed 3 of our guys. We couldn't contain him. He's extremely dangerous and violent, so much so that we had to get rid of him here and send him over to you all there. And I had a different view of Moses after that. Of this Moses. What role does a spiritual play? I would ask people, hey, do you know God? Can I pray for you? And many of them, their response was very important. Why, if I ask somebody with schizophrenia if you can pray for them, what might a person, if you ask, hey, can I just help you out, pray for you? I do other things, like, can I get you some food? Are you sleeping okay? Do you have anything else? And then praying for their spiritual needs. And sometimes their reactions are very telling. The guy that says, yeah, I'd love to eat some food. That'd be great. Well, get him some food. Someone needs shoes or clothing, go get them something if you want, or go find a place for them. And if you ask them, hey, can I pray for you? That's great, taking care of and sometimes their reactions are very interesting because of this possible question, that what role does the spiritual play? Certainly the question might involve this, and in some cultures it's very clear that they're going to say this is demonic. And I think they base that, and others will say that, it's because you see maybe some parallels. Biblically, we would look at individuals. Can you think of examples in the Bible of people that might be suffering from what looked like a psychological disorder could also be demonic?
There was that one kid who kept on throwing himself into the fire.
There was a person, in the New Testament, who kept throwing himself into the fire, and his parents came to Jesus and said, man, our son is just throwing himself in there, and it seemed like there was certainly demonic involvement there. And
the Legion guy?
Or the person that was called, he had many demons, called Legion, right? But Nebuchadnezzar, was it Nebuchadnezzar that ended up spending how long acting out in the 7 years, acting like a cow or whatever he was, and this is a great king, and he acted like he had a form of a psychological disorder. By the way, the Bible makes it extremely clear, ready? There is a spiritual world. There are demons involved. This isn't like something people just make up. That's why sometimes this culture can be so messed up, is like ignores that all the time. It is clear biblically that there are such things as demonic influences. And so sometimes when you see psychological disorders, there might be some similarities, like strange behavior or strength or voices or personalities. And so it would just be normal to ask, wow, is this deep? Now again, like I said, most psychologists in this culture don't tend to have the default of this is a demon. They tend to default, this is psychological, this is physical, this is brain chemistry. That's what this field, if you want, of psychology defaults to. But clearly there are times, and in other cultures they see it very differently, strange behavior, strength, voices, personalities. I will say this, ready? Other than Moses, and I've seen enough in a lot of different schizophrenics, I don't usually feel like it's demonic most of the time. Sitting there in a room one time, working in a different home with 50 behaviorally disturbed boys. Did I tell you the story of sitting there with this kid who was like 4 foot nothing, man? He was 15 and little. And I didn't tell you the story? I was sitting next to me and a fellow counselor had to go and tell him he was getting disciplined because who knows, I don't remember what he did. He did something wrong and bad. And so we're in this room and we get him back. And so the counselor I'm with is like 6'4", 300 pounds. He's a big man. And I was thankful. Because sometimes when you're with, so anyway, we're sitting there and there's a huge coffee table in between us and this, 4 foot nothing guy. And as we're talking, you can see he's getting, I'm starting to say, oh, okay, he's getting agitated. It wasn't as clear on him. He kind of was holding it in. But this guy was saying, listen, and you're going to be on restrictions, and why were you doing this, blah, blah, blah. And he snapped. And this guy was one of the few times I saw something very strange. He picked that coffee table up. He just picked it up. Me and this big guy couldn't pick it up. It was that big. He picked it up and he threw it at us. And the first thing I thought of was, get behind the big guy. That's what I thought. So he picked it up and I went, like that behind the big guy. And he took the brunt of the coffee table. And then it both landed on me and I was fine, but he was like, that's kid. We had to tackle him and fight him and hold him off and, wrestle him. There's sometimes there's, but does that mean just because he has kind of unusual strength like that or strange voices? Well, some people say, well, man, there's some similarities there. Okay, whole point is, we really need to be careful and thoughtful about this one, recognizing cultural influences, recognizing, and so let me just give you a real quick way of knowing some differences. I think one of the biggest differences is the reaction to when you ask to pray for somebody. Biblically, and in a lot of other cultures, you will hear people who have had much more experience dealing with people who have demon possessions, that their reaction to Jesus isn't very positive. Have you heard that before? I mean, even in the New Testament, in James, there's a passage that talks about even the demons know the name of Jesus, and what do when they hear the name? They shudder, they cry out, it freaks them out. And so they don't like this. I really had one experience that was kind of close to this, but it wasn't my experience. It was my good friend who years ago was a pastor out here, moved from Colorado, took a church out near Riverside, and he'd only been here a couple of months and was working in this church, and some other friends, pastors, called him, didn't really know him, but they said, hey, could you come and help us pray with this person? They're dealing with some spiritual issues and they want prayer, and they go over there, and it turned out it was much deeper than just prayer. In fact, this person was convinced it was more than just a psychological disorder. In fact, it was very much in his mind a demon. And the way he shared the story was that what convinced him of it was that this, as they would just pray with this person, first of all, the person didn't want to be prayed over. They would kind of ask for it, and then they would kind of scream out or yell. And then they had very interesting access to some information. And again, this is my friend telling the story. He's sitting there and they're praying over this person, and this person points to one of the other pastors in the room, or I don't know if it was a pastor, just somebody in the room, and said, who are you to be using that name? Why don't you tell everybody what's underneath your bed? And all the other three look at this guy and they're like, what does that mean? And later on, it turned out that the individual had a whole bunch of, I don't know, it must have been pornographic material and other things under his bed. And he says no one knows about that, and how this person would know would be impossible. So that's access to something called supernatural information. By the way, schizophrenics don't have that access. I'd walk into a room and there'd be a guy sitting there, and we were having like a I was like a consultation, seeing if he can get off medications, whatever, and he'd be talking and he would point up and we'd say, how you doing? Fine, except that TV, when it's on, it sends me messages. I get information from that TV, it comes into my brain, it tells me things. Well, it doesn't. He doesn't get a lot of insight from it, and it doesn't give him access to things that are, it's just strange information. It's confused thinking. Versus that, logical access to spiritual information, maybe even knowing things. So that's one way. Finally, another way is response to antipsychotic medications. Many people who are psychotic, dealing with, these troubled areas, antipsychotic medications help calm them, bring them back. And that's another way to show, okay, this might be that. I would imagine in other cultures, and if someone is dealing, with other areas, they wouldn't have access to some of this, but in this culture, antipsychotics have helped many people, and they probably don't have much of a bearing on the spiritual world, would be my guess. So those are questions on this one? Someone asked a question, so. Anything else? This is just thinking, we're looking still at the idea of what goes on with this very common disorder that is of the brain and maybe of other causes and symptoms and characteristics, but very difficult, very hard to work with at times. There's hope, 1/3 to 1/3 will get better, and they just get better. And then at the very other extreme, 1/3 to 1/4 don't ever get better. They're just chronic, and antipsychotics don't help. No questions? Schizophrenia? All right. Yeah.
So then, would, like the movie Shutter Island, does Leo have schizophrenia? Or
I didn't watch all of Shutter Island. It kind of freaked me out a little bit, but to be honest with you, it was on. I went, "Ugh, what is?" I kind of got in halfway, and I didn't know what was going on, so I never watched it. Was it any good? Yeah. Freaky. I don't know what it was. Was it about schizophrenia?
I don't know.
Maybe you don't know. Should I watch? I might go watch it. I don't know. I'll watch it over Thanksgiving.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.